Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We'll start in just a moment. We have lots of people jumping on, and we're excited for today's session. Okay, great. Hi, everyone. My name is Courtney Brown, and I'm a Senior Marketing Manager here at EDB. I'll be your host today for our webinar, Not All Open Source is the Same. I'm joined by Bruce Momjian, VP and Postgres Evangelist here at EDB, as well as Mark Linster, Chief Technology Officer at EDB. Before we kick it off, I have a few housekeeping items to go through. This presentation is being recorded. We're going to share the recording along with the slides after the broadcast. Your lines are currently muted. If you have a question, please feel free to submit them in the question panel. Today's session is scheduled to last just about 30 minutes. Then any extra time will allow for Q&A. If we don't have time to address your question, we'll be sure to follow up with you after the session. And now I'll handle it over to Bruce and Mark.
All right. So thanks very much, Courtney. So what we're going to do today is there's going to be a very, very brief EDB introduction. Promise won't take more than a few minutes. And then we'll start a discussion about why do you care about the license, right? I mean, there were historical reasons, a long time ago where folks just cared about the license, but there are other things that you should really be aware of before you embark on using a certain open source project or a package of software coming from an open source project. We'll talk about the need to understand innovation, long-term viability, and then we'll dive into Postgres, or Bruce is going to dive into Postgres and explain to us what makes Postgres so different and the things that we believe you should know about the Postgres project itself. And then we'll give you our perspective on guidance for open source selection. Okay. Now, before we go in, let me first start with introductions. Bruce, go ahead.
Hey. Hi, I'm Bruce Momjian. I've been with Enterprise DB for 14 years, like coming on 15, and working with Postgres since 1996. One of the co-founders and a core team member of the project.
Okay, great. And so that's why Bruce can really give you the background on what makes Postgres different, not just from a technology point of view, but really from the underlying community and open source mechanics. And I'm Mark Linster. I'm the CTO of Enterprise DB, and I've been here working with Bruce for, well, next week to be 8 years. Okay, let's dive in. So EDB, and as I said, I'll be very brief about EDB. We're database fanatics who care deeply about Postgres. That's what we do. We do Postgres and only Postgres. We've been in the Gartner Magic Quadrant for operational relational database management systems for 7 years, which is as long as Gartner has published this Magic Quadrant. And we've been recognized in the community also for our enterprise Postgres innovations, where we focus a lot on things like high availability, management, integration, and then also migration from Oracle. But today, we're not going to go into many of these things. We're heavily involved in the Postgres community, where since 2004, when EDB was founded, we've contributed significantly to Postgres. Things like the heap-only tuples, materialized views, parallel query, the upgrade mechanism, just-in-time compilation, serializable parallel query. All of those things were contributions from Enterprise DB to open source Postgres. In September, we acquired Second Quadrant, and Second Quadrant has always been the #2 contributor to, or another large contributor to Postgres, and they've done very, very interesting things. A lot of them focused on replication and high availability, and notably hot standby, the logical replication, transaction control, generated columns. So since September of last year, both companies are together, and we're really the largest dedicated Postgres company today. So going forward, and let's talk a little bit about licenses. okay, licenses, especially open source licenses. I was a developer for a long time. I was a IT leader for a long time. And our traditional concern has always been, is the license virulent? Meaning, is there GPL? That's pretty much the only thing I always had to account for. And as long as there was no GPL and I had the necessary precautions to protect us from a license perspective, we were ready to go ahead. Okay, but now that open source is really becoming so popular, and I think we all know, and Bruce has confirmed that 70 to 80% of all projects today leverage open source. Now it's become so popular, there are other things that we believe open source users need to be aware of. And we're not trying to do fear mongering here or anything like that, but it's just guidance that we know from our experience needs to be shared. Things like, can I rely on it on production? Can I build a product strategy on the software? Meaning, is this a one-shot deal, or will this software and the underlying community and maybe a company supporting it still be there next year and the year after? Can I partner with this community and really make them a part of my long-term strategy? Who is going to support me in production? Right? I mean, often developing an open source is easy, but then production concerns, that's a different thing. Is there somebody who offers me good production support that allows me to use the software in a 4 or even 5 nines type of environment? Is it going to be innovative? Right? Is it going to be, really leading the pack, or, is it really just 2 or 3 people in a garage doing something? And when I build on it, maybe one day I'll wake up and I'm actually not leveraging an innovation vehicle, but there's just a zombie that's still stumbling forward, and I can't even get support anymore. My operating system has been upgraded, and the software doesn't support the new version. Can they change their license model? And I think that's going to be a key topic now. I mean, just recently, there's been a lot of reports in the press about Elastic, right? They changed their license model. And again, now people who built on Elastic, they need to deal with the fact that suddenly something that was a recognized open source project no longer is a recognized open source project. And then something that's really important is, can I influence the roadmap, right? Because I use the software today because of the things that are in the software that I like. But as my needs evolve, as I use the software more and more, I will want to, get features put on the roadmap. I want to be working with somebody who can help me do that. Can I do all these things? So those are new concerns that come into the choice of open source that maybe a couple of years ago, when open source was less important, were not considered as much.
Yeah, I think a lot of people when they saw open source, well, it's free, I'm going to download, I'll just use it, and they're not thinking of the long-term life cycle of that software. And that's really what you're getting at, the concept that it might solve today's problem today. And of course, the GPL license issue is still an issue. But what we're realizing as open source has been in enterprises for a longer period of time is more of a pattern of looking at that entire life cycle of that open source and how it affects the software you're building on top of it is really, I think, the crux of the issue.
Yeah, and we're seeing that, for example, the support of production. We are tracking our support questions in terms of what are customers asking, during development. And it's actually very few questions because Postgres is really easy to use. And then suddenly the nature of questions and concerns changes as they move to production, right? And also the urgency, right? Before in development, if it takes a day or even 2 to get an answer, it's not great, but it's okay. Once you go into production, well, even 15 minutes is a really, really long time. If the system is down and something inexplainable happens. So really the focus changes. And in the past, it was really very much a developer focused perspective. And today, while the developers and the innovation is really important, the focus on production, support, and long-term viability are being added to the picture. So maybe Bruce, this comes from one of your bigger presentations. Talk us a little bit about the multiple parties here.
Yeah, having been in open source so long, I've seen the adoption process in companies, so many times. And what I sort of learned in most organizations, there are probably three stakeholders that make the decision of adopting open source. One of the managers at the top there, administrators and developers. And what I've learned is that when you're speaking to one of these groups, the types of things that they're interested in or the things that draw them to open source are different, obviously. Now that you look at it, it's obvious, but as you're going through it, it doesn't seem so obvious. So things like, cost, vendor lock-in, and development efficiency are often things that managers focus on, but administrators are often worried about interoperability and quality, and full feature set for administration. And developers have a tendency not to even worry about some of those other things. They're more interested in innovation and, sort of speed of development and speed of getting stuff to market. So what's interesting I found is that in a successful open source sort of movement within a company, you have to have these groups kind of aligned. You're not going to necessarily have all of them moving to open source at the same time, but you've got to speak to each group, sort of highlighting the things that they care about. And what typically happens in organizations is one or two of these groups get involved in open source. They sell perhaps to those other groups without you even doing anything. And then by the time you come in, they're already using open source in a major way. But again, the value of open source is multifaceted, and the nice thing is that each group has uh, its own benefits that sort of drive them in that direction. If it was just one group, if it's just managers who are trying to do it, you wouldn't get very far. Same thing with developers. If it's just one group, very hard to move things forward in terms of adoption of open source.
Yeah, and especially in databases, for example, if you can't get the administrator angle, considered, then you're building a data island, right? It may be great for a proof of concept, may be great for a first version, but at some point in time, somebody's going to say, hey, I can't talk to it. I can't get data in and out or not well. We have to migrate to a commercial environment, right? So really understanding all of these concerns is really important. Now, let's talk about the innovation and long-term viability, which I think is really a pet peeve of mine. I want to make sure that everybody understands that making sure you have a long-term viable choice is really, really important. And these things are different, right? Because the cost concern is obviously something that drives a manager, but knowing that the cost will stay what it is really important if you make a strategic commitment to a solution. If it's just a point commitment, well, it doesn't really matter. Even if next year, for some reason, the license model would change, it's probably not such a big deal. But if you're strategically saying, I'm going to go with this database or that technology or this programming language, you need to understand what you're committing to do. So cost stability is important. Now, you may say, why are we talking about this? Well, the thing is, if you're having an open source project that is really pushed by a single company, Mongo, for example, is a good example. Redis is another one where most contributions actually come from Redis Lab. In that case, it's one company who carries the cost for all the development and all the maintenance, and they have all the power to change the license and change the cost at any point in time. You have to be aware of that. The next aspect is viability, right? Again, are there viable economics around this community so that when you bet on it, when you make this software a centerpiece of your strategy, that you know that the strategy is going to hold water for the next couple of years? Meaning, are there enough people involved in this community so that even if somebody I don't know, leaves, gets hit by a bus, retires, whatever, that your bet on the software is still a viable one. We had a webinar not too long ago with a number of European financial services companies. And in there, one of the IT leaders talked about the fact that they built on open source software that they thought was viable. They hadn't really thought about it in detail. And then it turned out that it was just actually two people. And one of those guys left to take another job, and they had to, unwind everything and go back to another piece of software because they really hadn't thought about the viability of that open source project. And then the drive for innovation, right? Because again, you're betting on something. One of the key reasons people go to open source or developers go to open source is the innovation. Well, if there's not enough innovation drive and new stuff coming all the time, then again, that's not a sound bet.
And this gets to really that long-term view of open source, Mark, because I don't know of anybody who changes the license that all of a sudden your current version all of a sudden has a charge. I don't. Can you think of an example of that? I don't think anybody.
Current version, no,
No,
because
current version. So that's my point. Is that the current version? So you might look at cost, and you're like, well, it's open source. Why is there a cost listed there? Because you're looking at, aside from the cost of having a support vendor and stuff like that, which is something we haven't even talked about yet. The question is staying with that software over time going to have a cost associated with it? I mean, I hate to use the word bait and switch, but there's a certain sense that that's the process that some of these sort of open source company developed software uh, projects go in. Uh, so you have to think long term, what's the cost? Long term, what's the viability? Long term, what is the innovation path for that software?
Mhm.
It's not going to change today. And again, if it's a tiny piece of software and you don't care about it and you don't need fixes, you don't need support, and it's never going to change what it does, and it's never whatever. I don't know if there are that many pieces of software like that, but you can certainly say, all right, we don't care what happens in the future. We're just going to stay on this version. We don't need support. We're not going to be upgrading. But for any significant piece of software, obviously particularly database, um, you are going to be upgrading. You are worried about viability. You are worried that that software helps you to be innovative going forward. And that's where these things come in.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Okay, so really the innovation questions is there actually a community, right? And I mean, we'll talk about this a little bit later, how you can figure this out. Or is it just an individual or two or three? Um, you know, in a single company that doesn't that makes its software available, doesn't make an open source community. It's still just a single company controlling the fate of the innovation, the investment, everything. And
Yeah, the
then,
company could go out of business, right? And
sure,
it's done. Yeah.
yeah, or they take a strategic turn that you don't like, right? Or that's not useful for you, right? And then, is there really a community-driven roadmap that can be influenced? Be it because you bring in somebody who works in the community, contributes, be it because there is a company involved in the community and you sponsor work that that company does. But can you influence that? And you may say, well, why is that important? Well, it is. We had a large financial services company come to us and said, guys, you really need to invest some cycles in helping with vacuum and bloat, right? And we did a lot of work in Postgres open source to make sure that the dreaded wraparound problem is becoming, well, less of a problem, right? So if that financial services company could not have turned to us, there's no way to actually influence that roadmap, right? And Postgres has a great mechanism to allow input because there is not a Postgres company that governs the whole thing. It's an open process where individuals or companies can provide contributions and that way influence the roadmap. So viability. right? Who will support me when I go into production? That's a really, 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 really important question, right? Because, you know, 4 nines of uptime, you cannot do it if you can't get a response in 15 or maybe 60 minutes, right? And 15 minutes, I think, is like the minimum that you need because, you only have a few hours of allowable downtime. And if you spend an hour waiting by the phone for somebody to come back, or maybe on an email list, hoping that somebody's going to respond, well, you're not going to be able to do 4 nines in a responsible way. And then, is there somebody who's providing me an SLA for CVEs and bug fixes? That's needed because, again, if you have a known vulnerability that is published out there and you don't know how to get it fixed in time, again, you can't use your system for any kind of reliable production. Cost, we already talked about it. Can the license model change, right? Can somebody change the license model on me, right? I mean, and this happened. This is not, I mean, Elastic is not the first one to do it. Mongo did it in 2018. That changed from GNU AGPL to server-side public license, which, by the way, is not a recognized open source license. Cockroach changed from Apache to BSL for all, as Bruce said, for all new major releases, right? If you don't mind staying on the old stuff, you're safe, you're okay. But the new releases, they're all on BSL, which again is not a recognized open source license. So, you know, that's understanding the community and the potential economic impacts of the community before you make a strategic decision is important.
Yeah, I mean, are you going to get security fixes on that old release? Like, I don't know. It's a little scary.
Yeah, and the BSL says that after a while,
Yeah.
everything will revert to an open source model. But that basically means if you're okay to drive your grand aunt's car that's 15 years old, that's okay. If that works for you, good. If you need the latest and greatest and cutting edge stuff because you're, I don't know, developing a super duper new website that really needs the new features to engage with customers, well, then it's not. And for most of us, when we go to open source, we're going because of the innovation. I mean, cost is something that managers and CIOs emphasize a whole lot, but most developers go to open source because they want the innovation, the cutting edge. So relying on the fact that after 2 years or 18 months, it's going to revert to open source doesn't help you because again, you don't have the cost thing is not what you thought it was going to be. So, Bruce, talk to us a little bit about what makes Postgres different.
So Postgres comes from the sort of old school model. Old school seems to be used a lot in the Postgres phraseology. Originally developed at University of California, Berkeley under a government grant, DARPA. It eventually moved to community sort of driven open source in 1996 and has remained that way, up until today. So it does have a very vibrant community. It has dozens of large companies who are contributing to it every day, adding features to it and bug fixes and CVE fixes and putting out quarterly releases, minor releases, and yearly major releases of 170 or so features. It is when you look at the check boxes of what you need to use, what you need to look at for a piece of software to have long-term viability, Postgres kind of checks all those boxes. And some people may say, well, you're just saying that because that's what you are, and you don't really, you're a little biased. Well, we've seen a lot of these license changes over time. MySQL being the classic one back from the 90s, where it was really a company controlled open source project that kind of morphed into bought by Sun, and then Sun bought by Oracle. So and then forks of that software now being controlled by other companies. So it's we've seen this song before, that when you're typically uh, sort of betting on a database and standardizing on a database, you can't really think about just this quarter and how my software is going to work. you have to think about these long-term viability issues. And one of the reasons that Postgres has continued to sort of grow is because of that continued uh, process, which keeps the development open, which keeps other companies sort of involved, that sort of meritocracy and strong independence that kind of keeps it moving in a way that's driven by the user community and not driven by any of the specific companies.
Mhm.
The companies have an effect on it in some sense, but everything they do has to go through the community process, and we all know that that's a very harrowing, um, a cleansing process, I would say, that keeps everything kind of going in the right direction. So again, that's one of the reasons that Postgres has been able to go from a very small database when I started to what it is today, because it continues to add users and it doesn't really lose users very quickly. It's
Yeah.
has a very long retention span, and that kind of retention span just builds over time.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. And understanding, what's behind this is what's really making this very, very, very interesting thing, right? I mean, the notion that there is the Postgres Global Development Group (PDG) that that drives this through a very interesting form, and I think we're going to get in a few slides that talk about how the Postgres community is organized, and that it's not run by one company. As Bruce said, it's run by individuals, yes, who may be sponsored by companies, but there's lots of mechanisms in place to make sure that not one company can control the whole thing, right? And just as an example here, I think there's over 40 companies, and I listed probably not all of them, but most of them here, that have contributed in one form or the other to Postgres 13. And you can see that it's a global collection of large companies, small companies. Some are just users of software, others are in the software business, others are just in the support business, and they all contribute, and that's what creates an innovative and vibrant and especially independent Postgres community, and a software on which you can bet, right? So maybe Bruce explained this. This is a pretty neat slide.
Sure. So how do you create a community that lasts this long, that continues to remain vibrant? The way you do it is you have sort of a pretty well documented process of how things are done, how who's assigned to do those things, and what scope they have. So obviously, we've had 20 some years to develop this sort of structure, um, and effectively, what you have is a sort of a tiered kind of set of folks. The core team is very small and doesn't do very much, frankly. Does mostly governance type of decisions. Then you have the committers who are responsible for actually making changes to the software, and that's a larger group in the 20s or so. Then you have contributors who are actually generating the software that the committers are applying, and that group is typically in the hundreds. And then the commentators who are working on discussing features and talking about how they should be implemented and what things are wrong with the patch, and where the project and answering questions that people have about how to use the software. That number's in the thousands. So you have sort of this. That's the community who's developing the software, and then the larger group, which is kind of, I know Simon Riggs kind of developed this sort of idea. You've got people, an even larger group who he terms are careerists, who are really dedicating their professional career to the database, but really have no interaction in the production of the software itself, which is fine, because that's the majority of probably our user base is not involved in development. Obviously, I'm involved in that upper part, who's always worried about what's going into each release. But the careerists are sort of allowing the community to do what it wants, and are just waiting and for the next release of the software, and do their own evangelization and presentations and sort of outreach to help people understand how Postgres is being used. Then you have the larger customers, which really are using Postgres in a whole bunch of different applications. They have things built on top of Postgres. There are third-party apps built on top of Postgres. They don't care about Postgres. It just works for them. And there's a lot of those people who basically like, I've used a lot of databases. Postgres is the one I can just set it and forget it. It's less expensive. It does everything I need. It has cool features. This is where we want to go. But these customers may not even know they're using it. They're just benefiting from it. And then you've got sort of the confused, which are, yeah, it's kind of a funny term, but those are the people who really haven't switched to the new way of looking at software. They're in the old mindset that you have to pay for software for it to be good, that open source is less secure because you can see the code, that you need billion-dollar companies behind every piece of software that you're using in an enterprise. That type of thinking is going away. I've seen it morph over the years that I've been in the project, but it's still around. There's still people who don't understand why somebody would use Postgres. Why would they not use Microsoft Oracle or DB2? uh, I don't think my career is going to be benefited by using Postgres. Um, I love Oracle innovation. It's kind of a joke, but that's what they say. Um, and they're happy with where they are. And what's interesting is these careers or customers over time kind of wear them down. And we've seen a bunch of people who have moved even in the past couple months from that confused phase to the careerist phase where they've sort of seen the light and they've understood exactly what's going on. But a lot of it is taking assumptions that people have about software and the software industry and helping to express them explicitly and then challenging those assumptions and helping them to reevaluate where is the real software industry, where is real success in software, and where are my assumptions holding me back. And I think that's where that confused group comes from.
Yeah. And that then really, yeah, results in a very stable uh, piece of software. And Bruce, again, you've built a lot of this, the underlying processes. So you should probably speak to it.
Sure. So obviously, as a database, reliability is sort of your number one selling point. It features, of course, matching proprietary databases is a requirement, but we've kind of got into a really good cadence now where we're putting out, as I stated before, major releases with 170 or so features in each release. You can see them. They're on our website. You can look at the feature set for each major release. It comes out typically in September, October timeframe. But what's really interesting is because the software is developed open source, and we all know, or at least those who kind of watch the industry know, that open source has the ability to produce software quickly and of high quality at the same time. That's typically something companies cannot do. Usually they can produce high quality slowly, or they can produce features quickly, but they typically can't produce high quality quickly. Um, and what's nice about Postgres is that we've, as an open source project and other open source projects as well, have been able to sort of ground both corners and get high velocity, high innovation at the same time with high quality. So, we have a 5-year support process where we support 5 years of releases. The documentation is gone over with a fine tooth. We have some of the best documentation in the open source industry. At least that's what people tell us. And we're getting doc patches every week of little wording changes or things that weren't clear. Again, this is one of the things that open source does very well, is to iterate small changes and get feedback and and act on that feedback in a very efficient way. Like, and companies are pretty bad at that. You have to go through so many layers typically for a user to get some type of impact to the software, even if it's a documentation change. With Postgres, that loop of, I think this documentation or this feature needs improvement to getting it actually addressed by developers is a much shorter process. And again, that's what helps with that high velocity and high quality cycle. We have an active security team. We're considered one of the most reliable and secure databases out there. And of course, we have quarterly maintenance releases, as I already mentioned.
So that addresses really the kind of stability concern. Now, I don't think we're not saying that when you pick a piece of open source software, they need to do exactly this. But this is the kind of stability that if you want to make a bet, a strategic bet on a piece of software, you must have, right? If you look to Oracle or Microsoft, well, that's what they provide, right? That's what the company provides. Well, if you go to an open source piece of software, you need to look at, okay, do I get my similar type of stable platform, right? And then, you know, part of the concern that you should also have is the long-term viability, not just the stability. So long-term viability really means, is there an economic model that will support this open source community? Meaning the companies and the individuals who are involved in it, do they have, I mean, can they pay their rent? Can they make a little bit of money? Can they survive and thrive, right? Because again, you're betting on something that better should be alive and thriving and not a zombie that kind of barely stumbles from one OS release to the next. And that's where the Postgres ecosystem has really created an interesting way for companies to thrive on this, right? You have extensions where companies make a lot of money, like second quadrant BDR, Citus Data as an extension right now, part of Microsoft. You have Timescale DB, that's a value add distribution. You have forks of Postgres in Greenplum, Redshift, Aurora. So again, ways of making money, which is important because that's what's going to keep companies and individuals connected to the open source community in the long run.
And this is very hard for companies to do because they typically want to create a wall around their software, and control who can do stuff with it because it's open source. That wall doesn't exist. In fact, it's designed specifically to allow that permeability from outside projects into the core of the database, and to extend Postgres for workloads that Postgres and native Postgres may not be ideal for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that expresses itself in, for example, I mean, EDB is probably the largest contributor to, in terms of number of people who contribute to Postgres today. By far not the majority, by far. And that's really important because Postgres must remain an independent community. But even though we're big, we're like a little over a quarter of the active contributors, which basically means that even if we stopped contributing to Postgres, the Postgres community would, maybe there'd be a little hiccup, but it would just continue. So that's the kind of stuff that makes Postgres a safe bet, a safe strategic bet for companies, because there is so much resilience in that model.
Yeah, and some of our open source contributing companies are huge, like NTT or Fujitsu.
Microsoft.
I mean, they dwarf Oracle, right? I mean, these are just humongous organizations with dozens of people actually working in the project. So it is very comforting to know that those they're all out there and they're all sort of they're all sort of hoping for your success and working to make that happen.
And again, do we say every open source project that you choose must have exactly those characteristics? No. We're just explaining to you, this is how Postgres addresses those concerns. Other communities will have different ways of addressing them, but the concerns are valid. And before you make a bet, you should really kind of, understand these things, right? So in summary here, our guidance is you have to understand the license model, obviously. Now, keep in mind, GPL is not like evil, right? Linux is GPL. So, but you have to understand how you use it and does it have the right license exceptions, linkage exceptions, etc. And that's well understood. Your lawyers are well equipped to do, or they should be well equipped to deal with you on that. And that's the standard thing that you have to understand. But then the next thing is there really an open source community, or is it just source available from a company? Are multiple commercial entities involved with the community? That's sort of the thing that makes it a safer long-term bet, right? Could the license model be subject to change? Well, a lot of companies use a license assignment agreement, right? And once the license is assigned to an entity, you have to understand whether that entity is likely or could potentially change the license model. Again, it doesn't mean that if software has a IP assignment agreement that you shouldn't use it. It just means you have to understand how that modifies the bet that you're making, or how that influences the bet that you're making. You have choice of support vendors and integrators. That's important because an email support, just like the Postgres community, is really, really good. I mean, the people that are on the hackers list are fantastic, right? But do they give you a service level agreement? Do they promise you that even on the last day of the quarter, if that falls on the night of Saturday to Sunday, they'll get back to you in 15 minutes? No. That's where commercial entities are coming in that allow you to make the bet for production support. Can they really support you with CVE patches and bug fixes? Meaning, are the vendors that say, oh yeah, I'll support XYZ software, can they really do it? Do they have active members in the community so that they can do this, right? And then, is the community vibrant and innovative? There's a couple of resources here, but there's not, to my knowledge, a really good reference for you. But listening to the community, checking out the mailing lists, looking what happens on GitHub or Git as the Postgres community uses it is really important. And maybe Bruce, you have other ways how somebody could figure it out.
My heart really goes out to people because this is some work, right? And if you're using hundreds of pieces of open source in a project, are you really going to do all this? I don't know. It's a hard problem, Mark. With the in the old days, you only had 3 or 4 proprietary database vendors, maybe 6, and that was, you just picked one of those, right? And they all had the same kind of price structure and so forth, and some were a little better than others or whatever. But what open source has really done is open the door to choice, and with that choice comes weeding through all those choices to figure out, is this piece of software good for my company? Is it something I can standardize on? Is it something that I know is going to have the patches and fixes that I need and security fixes? And is it going to be long term? And it's a tremendously hard problem. I know a lot of people sort of end up relying on a Red Hat or Ubuntu or Debian or whatever, and they say, all right, I'm going to standardize on what that operating system is providing me. But there's a lot of cases, particularly in the frameworks and web development stuff, where it's like the Wild West. There's just stuff everywhere.
Yeah.
So it's just really hard. And any change in software, you build something on a piece of software and you have to change the underlying software. That's work, right? You got to test it. You got to re-architect your code sometimes to do it. It's not pretty. I'm not saying we can go back to the old days where we had a fixed number of database vendors or a fixed a number of web. We're all going to go back to a Flash, right? Adobe Flash or something. It ain't going to happen. So this is a very new time. This is a time where you have to sort of get rid of some of the assumptions you have about the software industry.
Yeah, and the model is just changing, right? In the old days, we used to make a reference call with Gartner. We asked for their DMB reports and other things, right? That's how we figured out if a vendor was, good to their customers and reliable, right? Well, the world has changed. And I'm not saying you should do this for every, I don't know, widget or drop down that you use on your website, but for strategic bets, such as a database, which is like there's few things that are more strategic
Yeah.
than that, you should absolutely do this and understand that. Probably also for, data integration software, for ETL software, for the web servers, etc. Right? It's probably worth doing this, but not for every single piece of open source software that you
Yeah.
use.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Good. All right. Well, I hope this was informative. I know we got a number of questions here, and we still have a wee bit of time to address them. Courtney?
Thanks, Mark. So a few questions that came through that I'm just going to reiterate for everyone is you will receive a recording of this session and the slides. You'll see that later today sent to the email that you used to register for the webinar. So have no fear, that will be coming your way. Otherwise, let's transition over to the questions that came through. So Mark and Bruce, the first one that came through is, what does EDB seeing happening in the marketplace? Like, what are the big compelling things happening that are motivating businesses to move to Postgres at scale for those larger projects?
I think it's two or three forces. One usually starts with cost, but what's hidden behind cost is often flexibility, right? So a CIO may say it's too expensive, and if you drill in, then you find out that it's actually too expensive to move to the cloud. It's actually too expensive to go to microservices. It's too hard, right? So that's one thing, and that's really what drives people into the conversation, right? Lack of flexibility, at least from a CIO perspective. And then Bruce often tells me, well, but if it was only cost, right? And they would just need to get on Postgres and then check, they're done, then we wouldn't see people come back and again and again and again to the conferences, right? They come once because of cost, because the CIO has said, go figure this out. We got to do something. We've been audited. The Oracle audit will happen to me once in my life and never again. Go figure out if there's an alternative. They come to the conference, they see that, yeah, half their competitors are there, and everybody is using Postgres. Well, if that was it, then they would never come back. But Bruce, correct me on this, but you've told me, hey, they come back and again and again and again because they understand the innovation and the power of the platform, right?
Yeah, I mean, money, it goes back to the triangle we showed earlier, the three triangles. Nobody nobody goes and evangelizes on cost savings. I mean, yeah, you're right. You save once and you're done. But and there's another presentation on my website where Black Duck did a survey and they surveyed people who moved to open source, and in 2 years after they moved to open source. So although cost was the reason they came to open source, 2 years after adopting it, cost was down to number 5 in terms of value of open source to the organization.
Mm.
So cost gets you in the door. We talked about the $5 supermarket chicken mark. Gets you into the supermarket. But what really keeps people there, I think, is the innovation.
Yeah.
Great. Another question we had is more around the community. Mark, you kind of said how even if another company were to stop committing, it's still such a large, robust community. So someone asked approximately how many core committers and contributors does Postgres have? So maybe do you want to just talk about, Bruce, how large and robust the community is in general?
Well, we only have 6 core members, but again, it's a governance team, so we don't need a big team there.
Mhm.
I think I gave the numbers. Basically, the committers are in the 20s. Um, Contributors are in the hundreds. Sort of people involved in the development processes in the thousands. So those are roughly the numbers. Again, we have a lot of people who, um, a lot of those people are actually employed by companies. So, uh, if you're going to spend a huge amount of time on Postgres, it's really hard to do as a volunteer. You can do some small stuff as a volunteer, but a lot of our long-term folks they didn't start out that way. They start out as community people, fully volunteer, and then there was so much demand for what they did, and so much understanding that if we can enable these people, give them more time to do what they're doing, the software will be better. Then that they were hired by those companies, and eventually that sort of propelled the software forward. So that was always one of my concerns way back years ago, is that some of the problems we were approaching were very difficult and they couldn't be done in a couple of weekends. And fortunately, we've had a rise of companies who have been willing to hire people to just do community development, and that has really propelled. And frankly, the volume of contributions is getting not unmanageable, but the volume is much harder to process now than it was even a couple years ago, because again, you have so much desire, and saying no to stuff too, right? Saying this is something we don't want is another challenge we have.
I did an analysis of how many people were actively involved in the last release, right? Actually contributed, right? Not, and you remember the pyramid that Bruce talked about, not the people who just commented, but the people who wrote software that made it into release, right? And there was 142. But that is support, and that's really important, by thousands of eyeballs, right? Yeah, these 142, they checked in their code, but there's probably 10 or 20 or more that read that code and provided input and commented on it and made sure that it is as good as it could be. So it's a very large community.
And if someone wanted to learn more about becoming involved in the Postgres community, where would you point them?
Well, I think the community website is the best place. There is an FAQ, which gives you an idea of how to get involved. There's a developer FAQ as well. If you're interested in just a snapshot of what's going on right now, there's a website called pglife.momgen.us, which is my website. It's a fork off of my website, and that has a dashboard that shows you kind of what's going on in the community right now, what the IRC channel is talking about, what the most recent patch applied was, what's the most recent news article and blog, and so forth. It gives you kind of a snapshot of everything that's going on, at any given time. It is a big community. So we have, you know, probably five, or we used to, before COVID, we used to have, a handful of events every month in different parts of the country, different parts of the world. I used to travel 90 days a year and do about 40 events, and that was just a small portion of what was going on. So there's in-person stuff, at least before COVID there was, and will be after. There's certainly chatter. We have a Slack channel, we have an RC channel. There's a huge email list that is really where the majority of the development and the sort of self-help activity happens.
Mhm.
And then, of course, there's blogs, and other sort of resources that people have. My website has a bunch of stuff, probably 20 or 30 presentations and recordings of various aspects of Postgres as well.
Awesome. We had another question come through, which I think is a good one for you both, because I think you've both talked on this subject before. But they wanted to know what kind of strategy would you use to improve and generate a culture for use of open source in more traditional companies?
Okay. I think I have a present. I think I have a webinar on that, and also a blog that I've done together with Bruce, and it's really, I think, as Bruce said before when we talked about the triangles, right? It's a top-down movement that needs to enable it, right? Because obviously a company needs to have the culture to do it and the drive to do it, right? Because moving from closed source to open source, just like any movement, is initially risk, it's change, etc. So it needs to be kind of encouraged from the top. And on the bottom, you need a culture that can learn the open source way, right? So what Bruce does a whole lot is evangelizing, right? Going into a company and helping everybody understand what Postgres is and who does Postgres and how to use Postgres and how to get started with Postgres, etc. And then create a culture inside the company that supports hackathons, that supports meetups, that supports lunch and learns, right? Because I mean, one thing about open source is it works differently, right? In the old days, when there was a new version of Oracle, we'd send people to class, and there'd be an Oracle expert, and they get certified, or there'd be an Oracle Center of Excellence. But here we create a community of practitioners. That's a different culture. It's a different way to go about it. It's a different way to communicate. And that really is a top-down movement and a bottom-up movement, and evangelizing and creating the room where people can try stuff, right? That where they can say, well, I know I could in 7 days on Oracle. I don't know how long it's going to take me on Postgres. And then to say, that's okay. Take a little bit longer. The first time, it will take you a little bit longer. Second time, maybe the same time as what you used to. Third time, you're probably going to be faster, right? So it's really a top-down enablement and encouragement, and then a bottom-up culture change. Bruce, what you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I think that's right. You sometimes the software comes in because the management pushes it down to the admins and the developers, but often the software comes in through the developers. They have a small app. They've used Postgres in the past. They've heard good things about it or whatever, and they deploy on Postgres without the other triangles even knowing about it. uh, and then a lot of times management will bring in somebody and say, "Hey, what do you know about this Postgres thing? Is it something we should look at?" And the person say, "Oh, we're already using it." And they're like, "What?" We're like, "Oh yeah, we've been using it for 18 months and it's using over here." Or we bought a third party app, and that
Mhm.
third party app is already using Postgres, and it's the database we have to worry the least about. Uh, so a lot of times it's that proof of concept that gets in the door. A lot of times un, unregistered, that often gets us on the radar, and then your trick at that point is just to grow with that reputation. So again, it's a scary thing to change databases. I don't dispute that, and that's why the low barrier of entry, meaning it's free to download, free to use in a lot of cases, particularly if it's a non-production workload, that innovation that it's known for, kind of together with the cost, kind of all pushes the thing in the same. It pushes all of the adoption in the same direction, even though everyone's going there for a different reason.
Great. So we're headed right up against the hour. I just wanted to take one last minute to say thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Mark and Bruce, for putting on such a great session. Any questions that we weren't able to cover today, a reminder, we'll take those offline, review them, and get back to you with answers as well. And the recording and slides will be out later today. So thank you all and have a great day. Bye.